I want to go over the colonial slavery discussion assignment that you have that's due on Thursday, February the 22nd. It opened today on February the 15th. Now let's take a look at it. You can open it up here on the home page, and remember, you see the various articles we have for the assignment. Let's open the Prince Hall on Slavery article. We can see a view of the screen, and you can see in this yellow highlighted region, this is the Prince Hall article. There's a little information about Prince Hall up here, and you can see the kind of arguments he makes. Now, he talks about the natural and inalienable rights to freedom. And this passage here looks very much like the international ideas of the Enlightenment. It's not that the Americans came up with this idea. The Enlightenment came up with this idea over in Europe. Then he talks about how slaves were torn from the embraces of their tender parents in violation of laws of nature. Now, that may remind you of Samuel Sewell's biblical references, but there's no direct evidence that he's getting this from the Bible. Finally, in the last paragraph, he talks about the colonists' difficulties with Great Britain and their arguments in favor of themselves based on the idea that England is treating them like slaves. So what Prince Hall is saying is that if you don't want to be treated like slaves, why should you treat us like slaves? Not just like slaves, but as slaves. So in other words, this passage here is very cleverly playing on the self-interest of the colonists. They don't want to be perceived as hypocrites. And Hall is saying if you don't want to be perceived as a hypocrite, then you ought to give black slaves their freedom. So that's a very powerful argument. Now, what does that make him? Does that make him an international anti-slavery advocate? Well, certainly this paragraph up here does. But down here, this seems strategic, because I don't believe that Prince Hall thinks that the main reason why slavery is wrong is because it makes the whites look like hypocrites. But he's going to use that because that's probably the best argument he can use to sway them over to his side. Okay, so that would be an argument for using the Prince Hall argument as an example of strategic slavery. Now, when we look at Diderot and D'Alembert, this passage is from the Encyclopédie, or the Encyclopedia, which was the greatest publication of the Enlightenment in France, and it talks about the slave trade. Now, what are the arguments that Diderot and D'Alembert are making to argue against the slave trade? I won't tell you, but I will tell you that it's got to be one of those four: international, religious, strategic, or secular. So, of course, it can have little bits and pieces of all four, but you have to decide what is this largely an example of. Now, since these people are French, Diderot and D'Alembert are French, that would be a strong argument for the international character of their position. But, obviously their arguments are also secular in tone and involve other elements such as religion. You have to read it to see. All right, so let's look back at the articles. And now you have the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, if you've never read it before, is very important to read. And you can see what kind of arguments Jefferson uses. At the very start of the Declaration, you have this paragraph right here, which is a let's try this. This paragraph right here, which is called the preamble. And this is where Jefferson gives the statement of philosophy. And this is pure enlightenment. This is pure John Locke right up here. So clearly he's influenced by the European Enlightenment. But down here, actually the preamble continues down here through this sentence. It's actually 2 paragraphs. It also includes this sentence. And again, this is pure Locke. The only part of this that's Jefferson is these 3 words right here, pursuit of happiness. Everything else is Locke. Locke talked about property, and Jefferson replaced property with pursuit of happiness, which is a broader term. Now, down here, for the rest of the document, practically the entire rest of the document, Jefferson is talking about what the king did that caused the colonists to want independence. It's a series or catalog of sins committed by the king, not biblical sins, but sins against the Enlightenment, really. So you can take your pick. You could argue that these so-called sins were strategic on Jefferson's part to break the loyalty that the people had for the king. But there's no question that he's sincere about the preamble material at the top. It's just that that's not original to Jefferson. That comes from the internationalism of the Enlightenment. Now, if we look at Samuel Sewall, The Selling of Joseph, this is a very interesting article. We can enlarge this. Let's see. This is a very interesting article. But you will have to read it carefully to understand the arguments that he's making. Now, most of his arguments are biblical, clearly. And you should be able to follow his argument and straight from the Bible. He talks about Ham, and he talks about other biblical references. But here and there, he also gives a few secular arguments, non-religious arguments. But largely, he's talking about the Bible, or he's using the Bible as a point of reference. So if you are in the religious group, this is an obvious one to discuss, but you have to give a specific example that he's using the Bible, and you have to make that as specific as possible, as I said. If you quote, make sure you don't quote very much. Most of your answer needs to be in your own words. So let's go back to the articles. One more time, we're not going to look at all of these. But when we look at Benjamin Franklin, I actually did you a favor. And in the excerpt from Franklin, as you see here, I actually highlighted the 2 paragraphs where you can find his arguments about slavery. And I want you to just ask yourself, what is Franklin saying here? In other words, here's the last paragraph down here. What's he saying here? What's the reason why slaves should be free? Is it for the slaves' benefit or for white people's benefit? And to make this even more interesting, is this what Franklin really believes? In other words, he may be more liberal, he may be more radical even, than he's making himself out to be here. Perhaps Franklin has much more democratic ideas about why slaves should not be slaves. Perhaps he just believes in the rights of man. But he's not going to use that argument because he's writing for white people, conservative white people, who want to see how liberating the slaves is going to be good for white people. So Franklin gives them what they want, or what he thinks they want. And so that is both strategic and secular. This is entirely practical from Franklin's point of view. He's not talking about the rights of man. He's talking about pure practicality. Finally, I want you to be very careful about something. I have given you some ideas in this video. I do not want you to parrot my ideas. I do not want you to simply state in your own words what I have just said. But I wanted to show you this video in order to show you how you can interpret these documents in answering the question. Try to interpret the documents your own way. I don't mean to say that you should make things up. What I mean to say is that if there is something that leaps out at you, go ahead and explain that. I'm also not saying that you can not use anything that I said. And so, yes, you can learn from this video, and you can make allusions to these arguments, references, but I want also to hear your point of view and to see the things you are discovering on your own. And I hope this helps you.